There was a tin box on the top shelf of Dorothy Aldrich's bedroom closet that nobody had ever been asked about. Not Earl, not Clara, not Tommy. It sat behind a folded wool blanket and a stack of old Christmas cards tied with kitchen twine, and it was the kind of ordinary object that becomes invisible simply by staying in one place long enough. A plain rectangular tin with a faded floral pattern on the lid, the kind that once held butter cookies and was repurposed afterward because Dorothy repurposed everything. Nobody asked about it because it gave no reason to be asked about. It made no sound. It took up no conversation. It simply existed on that shelf, in that closet, in the particular silence that belonged to things kept deliberately out of sight. But the tin was not empty. It had not been empty for a very long time, and the morning Clara discovered what was inside it, not by snooping, not by any deliberate act of searching, but simply by reaching for the wool blanket on a cold November morning in 1971 when Dorothy was in the hospital for a minor procedure and the house was in Clara's temporary care, was the morning that everything the family thought they understood about their mother quietly rearranged itself into something larger and more considered than any of them had imagined. If stories like this one, about the quiet, unhurried strength of an earlier generation, remind you of someone you once knew, consider subscribing before we go further. There are more stories like Dorothy's waiting to be told, and they deserve an audience willing to listen carefully. Clara was 19 that November. She had her mother's hands, precise, capable, economical in their movements, and her father's tendency to go still when something surprised her. She went very still that morning, standing in the doorway of her parents' bedroom with the wool blanket in one arm and the tin box in the other hand, looking at what the open lid had revealed. She set the blanket down on the bed. She sat down beside it, and she began, slowly, to understand something about her mother that she had been living inside of her whole life without ever quite seeing. The tin contained folded papers, small envelopes, and a composition notebook that Clara recognized immediately. It was the same kind her mother had always used for the household ledger, black and white marbled cover, pages ruled in pale blue. But this notebook was different from the one that lived in the kitchen drawer. This one was older. The cover was soft with handling, the spine slightly split, the corners rounded from years of being opened and closed in the dark of a closet shelf. Clara opened it to the first page. The date at the top was February 1957. 14 years ago. Clara had been 3 years old. The handwriting was her mother's, small, even, entirely legible, and what it contained was not a record of groceries or utility bills or the weekly household allocation. It was something Clara had no name for at first, a running account of a separate stream of money, small amounts, recorded with the same precision Dorothy applied to everything. 50 cents, $1.20, $2, sometimes less. Sometimes, in the better months, $3 or $4 at a time. Every single month for 14 years. Clara turned the pages slowly. The early entries were modest, the kind of amounts that would seem almost pointless to anyone who didn't understand what they were part of. But the amounts grew, not dramatically, not in any sudden leap, but with the steady accumulation of something tended carefully over a long time. By the 3rd year, the monthly entries were larger. By the 5th year, a separate column had appeared on each page, a running total, updated monthly, that told the story of what patience and consistency produce when they are maintained without interruption. Clara found the most recent entry. She looked at the total. She sat with it for a long moment, her hands very still on the open pages, the November light coming through the curtains at the particular angle it takes in late morning. Then she closed the notebook carefully, set it back in the tin, and placed the tin exactly where she'd found it, behind the wool blanket, in the closet, on the shelf. She went downstairs and made coffee. She needed to think. The thing that struck Clara most, sitting at the kitchen table that morning with her coffee going slowly cold, was not the number. The number was significant, more significant than she'd expected, but it was not the number that kept her thoughts returning to the same place. It was the dates. February 1957. Dorothy had started this in February 1957, which meant she had started it when Clara was 3 and Tommy was 6, and Earl was driving his delivery route the same as always, and the household was, by any visible measure, perfectly ordinary. There was no crisis in February 1957 that Clara knew of, no emergency that might have prompted her mother to begin a separate account of carefully saved small amounts, no dramatic event that explained the decision. Which meant the decision had not been prompted by anything dramatic at all. Dorothy had simply decided, in an ordinary February, to begin. Clara thought about this for a long time. She thought about the kinds of decisions that get made quietly, without announcement, without the pressure of a crisis forcing them. She thought about what it required of a person to see that far ahead, not to the specific future, not to any particular event or need, but simply to the general shape of time, and what time does to families, and what families need when time has done enough to them. Her mother had looked at the future in 1957 and seen not a specific threat, but a general truth, that life is long, and long life requires resources, and resources don't appear on their own in the lives of people who wait for them. So she hadn't waited. She had simply begun. Clara wrapped both hands around her coffee cup and looked out the window at the backyard. The garden was finished for the year, the last of the season cleared away, the ground bare and waiting. Her mother's garden, the same patch behind the garage where tomatoes and cucumbers had grown every summer for as long as Clara could remember. She thought about her mother's hands in that soil, about the apple butter, about the mornings she'd woken to the sound of her mother already downstairs, already working, already thinking ahead to something the rest of the household hadn't considered yet. She had thought she understood her mother. She was realizing she had understood perhaps half of her. Earl came home from the hardware store around noon. He was 71 now, his hair fully white, his movements a little slower than they'd been, but still deliberate, still the movements of a man who did things with care. He set his bag on the counter and looked at Clara's face and stopped. "What happened?" he said. Clara considered her words. She had been considering them for 2 hours. "I found something in the closet," she said. "Something of Mom's. I think you need to see it." Earl's face moved through several things quickly. Concern, confusion, a flicker of something that might have been old anxiety, the kind that lives in people who have spent decades in households where unexpected news sometimes arrived. Then it settled into the particular stillness of a man who has learned, over 50 years, to wait for the full picture before responding. "All right," he said. They went upstairs together. Clara retrieved the tin from behind the blanket and set it on the bed and opened it. She handed Earl the notebook without explanation. He sat down on the edge of the bed and opened it to the first page. He read the date. He was quiet for a long moment. Clara watched his face and saw something move through it that she didn't have a word for. Not surprise exactly, not quite shock. Something more like recognition, but recognition of a thing he hadn't known he was recognizing, as though the notebook confirmed something he had sensed at the edges of things for years, without ever bringing it fully into focus. "February 57, he said, almost to himself. "You didn't know?" Clara asked. Earl turned a few more pages slowly. His expression had gone somewhere interior, somewhere private, in the way of people processing something that touches old and deep parts of their feeling. "I knew she managed things well," he said finally. "I knew she always knew exactly where we stood." He paused. "I didn't know she was doing this." He said it without any note of grievance. There was no accusation in it, no wounded quality. He said it the way you might say, "I didn't know the sun rose that early," as a simple fact about something that had been happening regardless of whether you knew. He continued reading. Clara sat in the chair by the window and waited, and the November light moved across the floor between them, and the house held its particular quiet around the two of them, while Earl read through 14 years of small amounts recorded in his wife's careful hand. There were other things in the tin besides the notebook. 3 small envelopes, each sealed and labeled in Dorothy's handwriting. Clara had not opened them. They felt like something that belonged to Earl to open first, which was why she'd waited. He set the notebook down after a while and picked up the first envelope. The label said, "For Clara, education or life choice, whichever comes first." Earl held it for a moment, then he handed it to Clara without opening it. She opened it herself. Inside was a folded piece of paper, and behind it, flat and counted, a sum of money in small bills that Clara sat staring at for several seconds before she could say anything. "Mom," she said quietly, to no one, to the room. The second envelope was labeled, "For Tommy, same as Clara's." The third envelope was labeled in slightly different handwriting, perhaps written at a different time, the letters a little less precise, as though written by someone whose hands were not quite as steady as they once were. "For Earl, if ever needed after." Earl did not open the third envelope. He set it carefully on the bed beside the notebook and put both hands flat on his knees and looked at the middle distance for a while. Clara understood without being told that he needed a moment. She went downstairs and made fresh coffee. When she came back up, Earl was sitting in the same position, but something about his face had changed. The interior quality was still there, but it had shifted. It was no longer the face of a man processing a surprise. It was the face of a man who has just seen something he has loved for 50 years from an angle he'd never seen it from before, and found it larger than he'd known. "He never said a word," he said, not as a complaint, as a kind of wonder. "That was Mom," Clara said. Earl nodded slowly. "That was your mother," he said. Dorothy came home from the hospital 4 days later. The procedure had been minor, a small thing, quickly done, the kind of medical interruption that becomes more common as people move into their late 50s, and that requires a few days of recovery, but nothing more. She walked back into the house on a Friday afternoon with Earl beside her, moving a little carefully, but already looking ahead to what needed doing, which was simply her nature. Clara had said nothing about the tin on the phone. She had decided, without entirely knowing why, that this was a conversation for in person, that it required the actual presence of the three of them, their actual faces and voices, and the particular atmosphere of the house around them. They had dinner first, Dorothy's own soup, which Clara had made from the recipe she'd learned by watching it made for years, and which came out close but not quite, something in the seasoning slightly different, something in the balance of it that was familiar but not identical. Dorothy ate it without comment beyond saying it was good, which Clara understood to be accurate and genuine and not quite the full picture. After dinner, Earl cleared the table. Clara went upstairs. She came back down with the tin and set it on the table between them. Dorothy looked at it. She looked at it for a moment with an expression that Clara would think about for years afterward. Not surprise, not alarm, not even particularly the expression of someone caught. More like the expression of someone who has been carrying something for a long time and has just been told they can set it down. She looked at Clara, then at Earl. "I was going to tell you," she said. Earl reached across the table and covered her hand with his. "We know," he said. "I was waiting until it was enough," Dorothy said. "I kept thinking, not yet, not yet, it needs to be more. And then the years," she stopped. "The years go faster than you think." The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the November street held its particular Friday evening sounds: a car, a distant dog, the muffled television from the house next door. "It's enough, Mom," Clara said. "It's more than enough." "She never said a word," he said, not as a complaint, as a kind of wonder. "That was Mom," Clara said. Earl nodded slowly. "That was your mother," he said. What followed over the next hour was a conversation the Aldrich family had never had before, not because the subject had been forbidden, but because the subject had never existed in a form that could be talked about. Dorothy had built something in private, and private things, until they are brought into the open, have no language around them. Dorothy talked in the same way she did everything, carefully, with precision, without unnecessary embellishment. She told them about February 1957. She told them about Helen Paulson's closed curtains, which Earl remembered but had never connected to anything in particular. She told them about the decision she'd made, which was not a dramatic decision, but a quiet one, the kind made in the early morning hours, when the thinking is clearest and the noise of the day hasn't arrived yet. She told them about the sequence, about taking from the front, about the distinction between the reserve and the foundation, which she named for the first time out loud, using words she'd only ever used in her own mind. Earl listened with the full attention of a man hearing a story that is also an explanation of his own life, filling in the background of years he'd experienced without seeing all of what was happening behind them. Tommy, who had driven up that afternoon when Clara called him, sat across the table from his mother and listened with the particular quality of attention that belongs to people encountering something they weren't expecting and don't quite have a framework for yet. He was 30 now, with a family of his own, a wife, 2 young children, a mortgage on a house in the next town. He listened to his mother talk about February 1957 and thought about his own kitchen table and his own household and the distance between what his mother had been doing in 1957 and what he was doing now. The distance was considerable. He didn't say this out loud, but his mother, who had spent a lifetime reading the things people didn't say out loud, saw it in his face and looked at him with the particular expression she used when she was about to say something directly. "It's not too late," she said. "It's never February 1957 again, but every month has a front." Tommy was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded. "There is a question that sits underneath all of this, underneath the tin box and the composition notebook and the envelopes with the names on them, that is harder to answer than it first appears. The question is simply, why didn't she tell them?" Dorothy, when Clara asked her this directly that evening, was quiet for a long moment. She looked at the table, and then at the window, and then at her daughter with the measured gaze of a woman choosing her words. "Because telling changes things," she said. She meant several things by this, and Clara understood most of them. She meant that a saved amount, once known, becomes a conversation about what to do with it, and that conversation carries pressure, carries expectation, carries the accumulated wants of everyone who hears the number. She meant that the foundation, while it remained unspoken, was genuinely free, unattached to any specific future plan, available for whatever truly needed it when that need arrived. She also meant something harder to articulate. She meant that the act of saving, while it remained private, was fully hers. In a life where most things were shared, the house, the income, the daily decisions, the whole fabric of a long marriage, the foundation was the one thing she had made entirely from her own discipline. It didn't belong to Earl's working hours, or to the household budget, or to any external circumstance. It was the product of her own mind, her own consistency, her own particular way of seeing the future. This did not mean she had built it for herself alone. The envelopes with the names on them made that clear enough. But the building of it, the act, the habit, the quiet monthly decision was hers. Clara thought about this for a long time after that evening. She thought about what it means for a person to have something that is genuinely theirs, not in the legal sense, not in the sense of ownership of objects, but in the deeper sense of having made something that came entirely from their own character, their own foresight, their own willingness to do the unglamorous work of being consistent when consistency is not required and not rewarded and not even known about by anyone who might reward it. Dorothy had done that for 14 years. She had made something entirely from herself. Tommy was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded. The weeks after that November conversation had a different quality to them than the weeks that came before. Not dramatically different. Life in the Aldrich household continued in the ways it always had, with the routines and rhythms that Dorothy had maintained for decades. But something had shifted in the atmosphere of the house, in the way the family moved around each other and spoke and looked at things. Earl began paying a different kind of attention to the morning. He started waking earlier, not as early as Dorothy, that threshold remained hers, but earlier than he had, and on some mornings Clara, who was staying through the month, found him sitting at the kitchen table with his coffee in the pre-dawn quiet, in a way that seemed less like insomnia and more like something deliberate, like a man trying to understand a room he'd been living in for 20 years by sitting in it before everyone else arrived. Dorothy noticed and said nothing, which was its own form of acknowledgement. Tommy drove up again the following weekend with his wife and children. It was the kind of visit that families sometimes have after a revelation, not explicitly about the revelation, but shaped by it. The conversations were slightly more careful than usual, the listening slightly more attentive. His wife, Linda, who had heard the story from Tommy on the drive home the previous week, sat at Dorothy's kitchen table and watched her mother-in-law move through the afternoon with the focused appreciation of someone seeing a familiar thing for the first time. At one point, Linda asked Dorothy directly, quietly, when the others were in the other room, how she had maintained it for so long. Not the saving itself, the consistency, the unbroken monthly habit for 14 years. Dorothy thought about it. "I never decided whether to do it that month," she said. "I only ever decided to do it, once, in February 1957. After that, I was just continuing." Linda looked at her. "That's it?" "That's most of it," Dorothy said. She poured more coffee and did not elaborate further, because she understood that some things only become clear through doing them, and that elaboration is sometimes the enemy of understanding. There is a habit that runs through Dorothy's entire story, through all 5 parts of it, from the pantry to the ledger, to the foundation, to that November conversation, that is worth pausing on before we move to the end. It is the habit of making decisions once and then executing them repeatedly without redeciding. Most people redecide constantly. Every month, every week, sometimes every day, they re-examine the commitments they've made to themselves and find reasons why this particular moment is the exception, why this month is harder than usual, why the amount needs to be smaller this time or skipped entirely or addressed next month when things are easier. And things are almost never easier next month, which means the re-deciding continues indefinitely. Dorothy did not re-decide. She had made the decision in February 1957, and she had continued making the same decision every month for 14 years, because she understood at some level that operated below conscious thought that the decision itself was not the hard part. The hard part was the first one. Everything after was simply continuation. This is perhaps the quietest and most important lesson in all of Dorothy's story. Not the systems, not the envelopes, not even the foundation itself, though the foundation was real and significant and changed things for the people she loved. The lesson is about the nature of commitment, real commitment, not the kind announced publicly and maintained for a few weeks, but the private, undramatic, entirely unspectacular kind that continues because it has been built into the structure of how you operate, rather than left to the mercy of how you feel. Dorothy felt things. She was not a woman without emotion. There were months when the amount she moved to the foundation was painfully small, months when she looked at the figure and felt something close to discouragement. There were months when something desirable appeared that the foundation money could have covered, and she felt the pull of that. She moved the money to the foundation anyway. Not because she was invulnerable to desire or discouragement, but because she had made the decision once, and she understood that the value of a decision made once is precisely that you don't have to keep making it. Did someone in your family ever live this way? Did you grow up in a household where the quiet habits were more powerful than anyone acknowledged? Leave a comment, because these memories matter, and the people who carried these habits deserve to be remembered in the words of the people who loved them. By the time Dorothy was in her mid-60s, the foundation had served several of the purposes she had built it for, and some she hadn't anticipated. Clara had used her envelope for a year of art school. Not a full degree, but a year at a good program in the city that gave her the foundation, in the other sense of the word, for the work she would spend the rest of her life doing. She had cried when Dorothy handed her the envelope, and Dorothy had sat with her and said very little, and then made tea. Tommy had used his envelope not for education, but for a moment of his own. A moment when his family's circumstances ran temporarily tight in the late 1970s, and the margin between stability and difficulty narrowed to a point that was genuinely frightening. The envelope had provided exactly what margins are for, the space to get through a hard period without the hard period becoming permanent. His wife Linda had never forgotten it. She had told her own children about it years later, in a kitchen of her own, at a table of her own, using the story the way stories like this are meant to be used, as instruction, as inheritance. Not the money itself, the money was spent as money is meant to be spent, but the idea behind it, the understanding that security is not given and not guaranteed and not the product of income alone, but the product of the decision made in an ordinary month, in an ordinary year, by someone who looked at the future and decided to meet it with resources rather than empty hands. Dorothy's habits did not die with Dorothy. They moved. They passed through envelopes and kitchen table conversations and the quiet observation of children who grew up in a house where the front of the month was always addressed before the back. They became part of how certain people in the next generation thought about money, and they will become, in some cases, part of how the generation after that thinks about it, not because of any dramatic instruction, not because of any book or system or program, but because the people who learned it close enough to see it recognized something real when they saw it. That is how the best things pass forward. There's a moment near the end of every long story when the surface narrative and the deeper meaning draw close enough together that you can see both at once. We are near that moment now. Dorothy Aldrich lived an ordinary life by the standards that the world uses to measure lives. She lived in a modest house in a modest neighborhood. She raised 2 children on 1 income. She did not travel widely or accumulate possessions or achieve the kind of visible success that gets written about or remembered publicly. What she did was quieter than any of that. She decided in February 1957 to take her family's future seriously in a way that required no one's permission and no one's awareness. She decided to act on the belief that preparation is a form of love, that the woman who builds a foundation beneath her family's life is giving them something as real and as valuable as anything money can buy directly. She held that decision for 14 years without breaking it. This is not a story about pennies. The pennies were the method. The story is about the quality of mind behind the pennies, the willingness to take the long view when the long view offers no immediate reward, to do the invisible work when invisible work receives no acknowledgement, to trust that the accumulation of small, consistent actions is a legitimate and powerful way of shaping a family's future. These are not complicated ideas. They are not new ideas. They are ideas that were common knowledge among women of Dorothy's generation, women who had grown up understanding that households didn't run themselves, that stability didn't arrive on its own, that the emotional and financial atmosphere of a home was something to be tended the way a garden is tended, with attention and patience and the willingness to show up regardless of the weather. We have largely stopped teaching these ideas. We have replaced them with convenience and immediacy and the persistent suggestion that security can be purchased rather than built. And the cost of that replacement shows up in ways that are sometimes hard to trace, in the households that run right up to the edge every month, in the families that have no margin when margin is needed, in the people who reach a difficult moment and find that nothing has been set aside for it. Dorothy's story is not nostalgia, it is instruction. Earl lived until he was 83. He and Dorothy had 47 years together in that house, on that street, and by the time he passed, quietly, on a January morning with the winter light coming through the same windows it had always come through, the household he left behind was in order. Dorothy had made sure of it, in the same way she had always made sure of things, quietly, in advance, without any announcement. She had continued the foundation, not the same foundation. That one had fulfilled its purposes, had moved through envelopes and conversations and the lives of her children. But the habit behind it, the sequence behind it, the front-of-the-month discipline behind it, that continued. It simply served different purposes as the decades changed. The amounts were different, the needs were different, but the structure was the same. Dorothy was not a woman who stopped. That was perhaps the thing about her that Clara and Tommy came to understand most fully only in her later years. Not any specific habit or system, but the quality that made all the habits and systems possible. She was not a woman who stopped. When a purpose was fulfilled, she found the next one. When a goal was reached, she identified what the resources should serve next. When the foundation had done what it was built to do, she built another one, smaller, for the new shape of her life. She did not stop preparing. She simply changed what she was preparing for. There's a particular kind of person, not common, not celebrated, but recognizable once you know what you're looking for, who approaches life this way, who treats the future not as a destination to be reached and then rested from, but as a continuing condition to be met with continuing preparation, who understands that the work of building stability is never truly finished because life is never truly finished, and that the appropriate response to completion is not rest, but continuation. Dorothy was that kind of person. She remained that kind of person until the end. Clara found a second notebook in the tin. She hadn't noticed it initially. It had been beneath the first one, thinner, its cover more recent. She found it several weeks after that November conversation when she was helping her mother reorganize the closet. She held it up. Dorothy looked at it with a slight smile. "That one's newer," she said. Clara opened it. The first entry was dated January 1972, 1 month after the November conversation. Dorothy had started a new account the month after her family discovered the first one. "Mom," Clara said, with a combination of amusement and something else, something closer to reverence. "The old one was finished," Dorothy said simply. "This one is for whatever comes next." Clara stood in the closet doorway looking at her mother and felt, not for the first time, but more strongly than she usually felt it, the particular form of love that flows in the direction from child to parent, the love that is mixed with recognition and respect, and the particular ache of understanding someone more fully than you did before. Her mother was 71 years old. She had been doing this for 35 years. She had built and fulfilled and rebuilt without stopping, without announcing, without requiring anyone to understand or approve or even notice. And she had started again the month after they found out, because the finding out had not been the point. The finding out was incidental. The point was the doing. The point was always, had always been, would always be the doing. "Who's this one for?" Clara asked. Dorothy took the notebook gently from her daughter's hands and set it back in the tin. She placed the tin back on the shelf behind the wool blanket with the same precise movement she'd used for 20 years. "We'll see," she said. "There is a kind of wealth that never appears in any account statement, never gets discussed at any financial institution, never shows up in the arithmetic that the world uses to measure how people are doing. It is not made of money, though money can be one of its instruments. It is made of habit and time and the quiet compounding of consistent decisions made in the unglamorous privacy of an ordinary life." Dorothy Aldrich had that kind of wealth. She had it in the early mornings before the house woke up. She had it in the composition notebooks and the tin box and the envelopes with the names on them. She had it in the foundation and in the rebuilt foundation and in the second notebook started in January 1972 and in all the small decisions that nobody watched her make over the course of 50 years of keeping a household. The world she lived in did not celebrate what she did. It barely noticed. The culture around her was moving in the opposite direction, toward more spending, more borrowing, more of everything now rather than anything later. The advertisements and the installment plans and the shopping centers going up on the edges of town were all saying the same thing. You deserve more, and you deserve it immediately, and the future will take care of itself. Dorothy had never believed it. Not because she was suspicious or rigid or afraid, but because she had a different relationship with the future than the one being sold. She thought about the future the way a farmer thinks about the next season, as something real and approaching and worth preparing for with the resources of the present. She thought about it with respect, with the specific, practical respect of someone who understands that the future arrives regardless of your feelings about it, and that what you have when it gets there depends entirely on what you've built in the time before. She built something. In an ordinary house, on an ordinary street, with ordinary income and no special advantage, and no audience and no recognition, she built something that lasted, that fed children and funded educations and absorbed crises and created margins and passed into the thinking of the next generation and, through them, into the generation after that. She did it with a composition notebook and a pencil and the decision made in February 1957 to take from the front. Think about someone in your life who lived this way, a mother, a grandmother, an aunt, someone whose steadiness you took for granted because she had arranged things so thoroughly that there was nothing alarming to see. Leave her name in the comments, or simply leave a thought, because these women deserve to be remembered, and the habits they carried deserve to survive the generation that held them. If this series has stayed with you, if Dorothy's story has reminded you of something real, something worth holding on to, please share it with someone who would understand it, a daughter, a sister, a friend who is sitting at her own kitchen table trying to figure out how to make things work. Like this video if you found something here worth keeping. And take what Dorothy knew into your own February, whatever month that is for you, whatever the year. Find the front of it. Write the number first. The rest can wait. The foundation cannot.